Let's talk a little bit about chapter 27 and the sexual reproductive system, the male and then the female. The female, for the most part, I have highlighted this already, so hopefully you guys can see just what I would like you guys to focus in on. Now, with the two, with the reproductive systems, we're not going to talk about the physiology, even though for the male and the female, the interactions of the hormones are so interesting. It's so much more physiology related than anatomy. That's one of the reasons why we kind of curtail it from our uh, our curriculum. So we hopefully will have time. You will have time in 179 to go through it if you do have to take 179. Now, when we're talking about the sexual reproductive system, what we're going to see is that, right, we have the two sexes, right? That with the two sexes, right? Depending on if you have X and the Y chromosomes or two X chromosomes, you're going to have either testes or ovaries. Now, that's dependent on what you inherit. Also, keep in mind that that does not mean that if you have an X and a Y, that you will always look like morphology wise like a male. There are a lot of other things that contribute to the male versus the female appearance, much less talking about just inherently how somebody emotionally feels about their sex. So we're talking about just biological sex right here. It is dependent on your X and a Y, right? And if you have X and a Y, you're going to have the presence of what should be testes. And if you have two X's, you're going to have what should be, right? Somebody who's going to be ovaries and a female. Now, keep that in mind that, all right, based on what you inherit in terms of the chromosomes, right? For as males, we produce both X and Y chromosome sperm cells. We have 50-50 mix of X and Y chromosome sperm cells. Right? Females only have eggs that only contain X chromosomes. So inherently, right, the sex of the baby will be dependent on whether it's an X chromosome sperm or the Y chromosome sperm that is going to fertilize that egg. Now, also keep in mind that once you have the X and the Y, right, when you're first conceived, you actually have two sets of ducts. One set of ducts that are going to turn into the male vas deferens, epididymis, prostate, right? The whole situation there, right? That allows us to connect the testes to then eventually the urethra, right? You also, when you first conceive, have a second set that will turn into the female reproductive tract, which is going to include, right, you're going to include the uterus, you're going to include the fallopian tubes, things like that. Now, again, when you first conceive, you have either testes or ovaries, but you're going to have both sets of ducts. And what occurs then is as we start developing, one set of ducts start to die off, and one set of ducts starts to increase in size. So what we're going to see is for males, that Y chromosome is so important because early on gestation, Y chromosome activates production of testosterone. So then the male ducts form. It also causes some kind of inhibiting effect on the female ducts, right? Now, if there's a problem at all with testosterone release, or you might release testosterone, but the cells might be insensitive to it. They don't have the receptors, right? What happens is you might have testes, but the male ducts never form. And you'll have what looks like the female sexual reproductive tract, right? And that does happen from time to time, and it's pretty rare though, right? But that does happen. And there's nothing, it's not something that, the child chooses, all right? All right. Now, as we go through this, right, the primary sex organs know the difference between primary and secondary. Primary are either ovaries and testes. The rest are all secondary. The series of ducts, in any ways and means to deliver any kind of, right, sperm cells or anything like that, right? Or any kind of canals that allows you to introduce sperm cells. Those are all part of the secondary sexual organs. All right, so let's go through more of this. All right. And again, review what I've just mentioned about, right, the X and the Y males, right? And how it's, females only carry the X chromosomes. Males carry either an X or Y on one of the sperms. And what normally happens is you have an X chromosome sperm cell that fertilizes the egg, right? You're gonna have a female that's XX, right? If you have a Y sperm cell, you're gonna have an XY male. Now, we have seen that there are in certain cultures, right, where you have a very paternalistic culture where you want more males, right? And males inherit all the family business. Well, in areas like that, like in China, India, what happens is we do have a way of separating the X and the Y sperm. Now, the problem with that is if you keep having families that just, have males and more males and more males, you're going to have an issue with what China is going through right now, where there's not enough females for all the males to kind of get in relationships with. And it is something that we're going to see. And what makes it worse is because of the no child, the one child policy there, right? A lot of the females that were born in China, right, were adopted out. So in America, we see a lot of female, all right, Chinese girls that are, adopted by American families as a result of this. And what we're going to also see in the next 5, 10 years is an abundance of male, right, adults that don't have any female adults to kind of interact with there. And we're going to see, right? It has become an issue now that, right, that I believe not just now, but the last 10 years, right, that China had stopped their one child policy about 10 years ago. And now they're in actual, right, almost like Japan and us, where we're kind of pushing families to have more kids, right, which is a far cry from one child policy that they enacted for almost half a decade, half a, century, right? Now, in terms of the male reproductive system, the male reproductive system, the main primary sex organ is kind of different in that the actual sex organ, the testes, is actually separated from the rest of the abdominal region where everything else located. So, in order for us to bring sperm from the testes, which are separated, we need some kind of passageway, some kind of duct that carries it from the testes, the sperm carries it from the testes, right? Then it has to enter our abdominal cavity. Then it's got to somehow be integrated and released into the urethra. So how we do this is by the presence of something called the spermatic cord. The spermatic cord contains muscles. It contains the vas deferens, lots of blood vessels, and a testicular nerve. Now, the big thing is understanding that in order for males to produce viable sperm, we need to have a core body temperature at about 35 degrees centigrade. So about 96 degrees, right? 95, 96 degrees Fahrenheit. Now keep that in mind. That's, our normal body temperature is 98. So it's not like we have to really cool it tremendously, right? Maybe you have to cool it maybe 3, 4 degrees and that's it, right? But anything close to our normal body temperature at 37 degrees Celsius right here, that's too hot. And the sperm will not be produced and it won't be viable at that point. So we have a lot of systems to make sure that we have a way of cooling the testes so then we produce viable sperm. Now, keep in mind, it is all about the sexual reproduction, right? Reproduction is huge. Now, what are the things that I mentioned before when we went through it last week? Number one, we have a series of muscles there. Cremaster, right? Muscle is going to allow the testes to drop away from the abdomen so we can cool it when your core body temperature gets too hot. Example, after a hot shower. The cremaster muscle relaxes, allows the testes to descend. Now, on a cold day like it is outside right now, the cremaster muscle contracts and it allows the testes to move up closer to the abdominal cavity. So then the actual heat will then allow the testes to not be so cold that it can't produce viable sperm. Remember, cool, not cold. Now, another kind of muscle we're going to see is actually found in the subcutaneous tissue of our scrotum. And it allows us to wrinkle up the testes when it's really cold, so then you don't lose excess, heat, right? Again, cool, not cold, right? And, right, when it's really hot, we relax the dartos, we can expand the scrotum, and we can release excessive amounts of body heat. Even the blood that is coming in needs to be coming in and out through a series of these pampiniform plexus so that we can cool the blood that is going to be right reaching the testes. Cool it about 2 degrees by way of this pampiniform plexus countercurrent heat exchanger. Right, it's kind of cool. Now, the testes itself are going to be, right, so they take a look at this, right, divided into lobes or compartments. And within each lobe or lobule, you're going to have a tubule here where we have stem cells that will then undergo meiosis, right? And produce, for each stem cell, we're going to produce 4 spermatotids or sperm cells, right? The sperm cells are going to be produced in the seminiferous tubules by way of meiosis, and then they're going to be brought to the epididymis where they are going to mature. Maturation means that they form a viable, right? Those cells are going to have an enzyme that allows it to eat through, right? Some of the membranes found in the egg that's released by the females, right? It's going to act and have a functional flagellum. So then the sperm cell can swim its way upwards, right? And then hopefully beat other sperm cells there so then it can fertilize the egg. Now, in terms of the testes, right? Like I mentioned, we have the seminiferous tubules, and then we have these cells I want you to know interstitial, right? And sustenticular, right? Now, interstitial cells produce testosterone. Sustenticular cells, right, allow the actual stem cell to undergo meiosis to, right, then produce lots of sperm cells as a result of meiotic kind of divisions, right? Now, again, right, we kind of mentioned the testes and what happens here. So none of these are, something I want you're going to do too much detail at. So if you understand why everything needs to be cooled down and what are the mechanisms for the final exam, right? The pampiniform plexus, what does it do? The dartos, cremaster, right? What do they all do, right? If you're able to explain it to yourself, then you'll be in pretty good shape for the final exam. Now, again, once we are producing the sperm, is going to the epididymis where the sperm cells are going to mature. They stay fertile for 40 to 60 days. And if there is no ejaculation of those cells will get reabsorbed and die off, right? If there is, then obviously, right, the sperm cells are going to be functional. They're going to have an enzyme head region that allows it to eat its way through the plasma membrane of the oocyte or egg, right? And it's going to have, right, the functional flagellum that allows it to swim upwards from the cervix up into the, right, the fallopian tubes. So then we get a fertilization, right? So the male urethra, if you take a look at it, is very long, right? And the male urethra is named after the actual region it goes through. And unlike the female, the male urethra is going to be the passageway for both urine and sperm, which makes the internal urethral sphincter so much more important for the male reproductive system. Now, the urethra, as it goes through the prostate gland, right? Well, since it goes through it, any enlargement of the prostate can compress the actual urethra as it goes through. As the urethra goes out of the actual abdominal cavity, it goes through an area we call the membranous urethra, right? And that's where we have a little bit of the bulbourethral gland secretions kind of mixing in here when we have sexual reproductive functions. And then the urethra continues out, right? And it's going to be surrounded by erectile tissue we call the corpus spongiosum. That region where we have the erectile tissue, right? Well, now we have the urethra named after the erectile tissue, and we call that region the spongy urethra. Now, the real reason why we have so much erectile tissue is for the process of having an erection. Having an erection means that the orifice of the penis, right, once we have ejaculation, right, all of the sperm goes up from the epididymis, goes into the vas deferens, then it's going to be brought into the ejaculatory duct where all that sperm gets mixed in with seminal fluid, that seminal fluid, right, is going to contain lots of right proteins, lots of glycogen and fibrin and a little bit of fructose. So then, right, there's kind of a energy source for the sperm cells, right? And now we're going to introduce that combination of a little bit of semen and sperm into the ejaculatory duct. And since the penis is now erect, right? The head of the penis and the opening right here is going to be right next to the cervical opening. So if you have ejaculation at that point, you're going to introduce all that sperm, all that seminal fluid right in the opening of the cervix. And you're going to concentrate all the amount of sperm in that opening. So now we're maximizing the chance of actually having enough sperm cells that can go up the cervix and then cause fertilization. Remember, right? Sexual reproduction is about reproduction here. Everything is meant to increase the chances of reproduction, even the fluid that we see, right? There's a reason why a little bit of that seminal fluid is sticky, is because there's a lot of clotting factors there. So then once you have ejaculation, you can concentrate that sperm right at the opening of the cervix, right at the external and internal os, right? And again, this kind of discusses it. So review the erectile tissue right here. And the last thing we're going to talk about in terms of the male reproductive system is, right, the head is the actual sperm cell right here. Here's a sperm cell over here. Here's the tail pieces right here, right, has the actual flagellum here. The mitochondria here powers the flagellum. Now, the thing is, right, the head region, this is where the nucleus is. These are 23 chromosomes, right? 22 chromosomes and an X chromosome, 22 and a Y, right? Well, either ways, we have 23 chromosomes from this sperm cell is going to meet and fuse with 23 chromosomes from the egg. Now we have the two sets of 23 chromosomes that makes us who we are. One set from dad, right here, one set from mom's egg, right? Now, in order to do that, though, you need to have this acrosome region that contains enzymes that allows you to kind of eat, right, through the plasma membrane, right? And all the support cells found in an ovulated egg. Without a functional acrosome, you're not going to be able to penetrate through the plasma membrane and all the support cells that follows that egg as it's ovulated out. Now, also important thing to understand is, remember, the mitochondria here is not coded for in the nuclear DNA. And what happens is only the head region enters the actual oocyte or egg, right? This tailpiece never enters it, right? And what happens is, because of that, none of dad's mitochondria is ever introduced into the oocyte, right? All the mitochondria we've ever had are always only from mom then. And this kind of describes what I was mentioning just now, all right? Now, in terms of semen, all right, so just understand that, it's just that fluid. A lot of it is from the seminal vesicles. You're not going to need to know the what is a normal sperm count, right? What is a, you know, sperm count for infertility. Don't need to know that. I'll stop here and I'll have another recording for the female reproductive system coming up.